Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. Happy Republic Day to all of you. A very quick introduction of what we have gathered here to have a conversation about. If you've read the program, then you'd have read that the future of the world's urban population is poised to be centered in China, in India, and in Nigeria. They will account for 35% of the growth in this context. And India will be taking the lead where this growth is concerned, which means that we're headed for a large urban population, even larger than now in times to come. And this begs the question that are we ready for it? In terms of human capital, in terms of the economy, in terms of jobs, in terms of the environment, in terms of infrastructure. And those are some of the things that we will be discussing and asking ourselves over the next 45 to 50 minutes. And then I hope to open it up to all of you to participate. So once again, may I ask you to please welcome our panelists with one round of applause. Thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to start with a rather fundamental question. And perhaps start with you, Amitabh, because we're also, there's a wonderful book that he has edited that is available in the bookstore that is sort of a little bit the basis for this conversation, which talks about India's path ahead in this context. Amitabh, I'll start with you, and I just want you to give us a sense of what is driving this urbanization, and is it necessarily a good thing, in your opinion?
Pragya, if you look at the world, the cities occupy just about 3% of the Earth's landmass. But they account for almost close to 80% of the global GDP. And cities also account for about 75% of the CO2 emissions in the world. The process of urbanization has ended across Europe. It's ended across America. It's nearing its completion in China. The process of urbanization has just begun in India. And we are going to do more urbanization in the next 5 decades than what we've done in the last 5,000 decades. Next 5 decades as compared to the last 5,000 years. And therefore, every minute as I speak here, there are 30 Indians who are moving from rural areas to urban areas. And if you go by the latest McKinsey study, by 2050, you will have over 500 million Indians getting into the process of urbanization. Whether we like it or not, 500 million Indian means that the challenge for India is to create 2 Americas. And when America urbanized, land, gas, water were all cheaply available. America had the luxury of living in New Jersey, guzzling gas, traveling to New York City. They had the luxury of creating a city like Atlanta where 99.8% of the people travel by car. So American cities were made for cars and not for people. The American car companies bought over the railway companies and destroyed them so that cars could sell. As I said, the process of urbanization has ended. When India begins its process of urbanization, land, gas, and water are all scarce commodities. And therefore, how we do our urbanization in the next 5 decades will determine our future. Urbanization is inevitable. People will move from rural areas to urban areas, whether we like it or not. And the challenge for India is to do innovative and sustainable urbanization. And the lessons of this do not come from the western part of the world, they come from the eastern part of the world. They come from Singapore on how to recycle water. They come from Kitakyushu in Japan, where the women of Japan, Kitakyushu, where the Dokai Bay on which it was based had turned into yellow from blue, rose in revolt against the industrialization process in Japan and made it one of the smartest cities of the world. Everything is recycled. They come from Yokohama, where a lady mayor was able to reduce waste by 48%. They can come from Indore city of India, which is in 5 years' time changed from being one of the most polluted cities to one of the cleanest cities in the world. They come from Curitiba, where within 2 minutes, every person is able to get a public transportation system to move. And therefore, India's urbanization is inevitable. And the challenge is to do planned, innovative urbanization, not unplanned, unscientific urbanization, which we see when we drive from Delhi to Jaipur city. And if we are able to do innovative, sustainable urbanization, we will be able to hold a model for the rest of the world. That is the challenge for India.
Please.
So just to jump in on that, I think I couldn't agree more that urbanization is inevitable. I couldn't agree more that we have a huge opportunity to build cities in ways that make sense, and to amplify on what Amitabh said, we are the first country to actually urbanize in a post-Paris Agreement climate change world, where we will have to do so in a way where space is constrained, carbon is constrained, hopefully energy is not constrained. These are all huge challenges, and I also agree that the experiments will come from our partner countries in the south. I just want to add some important nuance. When we think of urbanization, our imagination moves to Delhi, Bangalore, Jaipur, etc. But India's urbanization is taking an interesting form. Some of it is happening in the mega cities, but a lot of it is happening in the mid-sized towns. A lot of it is actually happening in areas that we think of and treat as rural areas that are census towns. So half of India's manufacturing happens in census towns, and the manufacturing workforce happens there. So when we talk about urbanization, we have to make sure that our imagination extends beyond the giant cities to the census towns and the mid-sized towns. And the patterns of urbanization, the solutions we will need for those places are actually quite different. So I just wanted to add that, and I'm sure Amitabh wouldn't disagree, but it's an important qualification.
So, beyond the climate-constrained world and the resource-constrained world that both the previous speakers have outlined, I think there's another new trend that we need to keep in mind as we start preparing for an urban India, and that is we will be the first country to urbanize in the fourth industrial revolution. Now, that means a hell of a lot, and we don't pay enough attention to it. The patterns of work, the patterns of production, the patterns of consumption, electricity, energy, mobility, jobs, workspaces are all going to dramatically change and transform. Are we building commercial spaces when everyone is working from home? Do we need to rethink the distribution of commercial versus residence? Are we looking at building underground electric cables, laying underground electric cables and fiber pipelines when actually homes can become producers of energy? And we will need to create methods of taking energy produced by small and medium building owners, apartment complexes, etc. So I think the fourth industrial revolution is going to dramatically alter not only the way we organize and plan for cities, how we retrofit existing cities, how we develop new ones, but it is also going to change the politics of the city. We are also going to be the first urban country in the post-cosmopolitan age. We are now no longer going to be identified by the PO box and where we work and where we live. The politics, once the workspace changes, once you don't have the unions, once you don't have the pro-labor and anti-labor and the pro-capitalist and the anti-capitalist parties, you will see a whole new political ethos emerge. Street protests, hashtag mobilizations, hashtag capitalism. You will see a very different political culture emerge. And guess what? There are no ready reckoners for us to dip into. We will have to, in some sense, do what the Chinese do, cross the river by feeling the stones. So I think our urban process will be by trial, and you will see a lot of errors. It will be very easy to jump to sometimes cynical positions, but I think we will have to stay the course. It is going to be a slightly turbulent process. It's not going to be an easy process.
Thank you all for that wonderful introduction. I think there's a lot to unpack there. And I definitely want to come back to the issue of urbanization in the post-Paris Climate Accord world. But I want to start with something a little bit more basic in terms of what our cities are equipped to provide in terms of building human capital. And I will talk about healthcare and education very quickly in that respect. Let's start with healthcare. I think there is a consensus, I hope there is a consensus that we need to spend more on healthcare. But the other aspect to be addressed, of course, is also regulation, because both when it comes to public and private healthcare, there are issues that are unresolved at this point in time? Starting with you, Amitabh, thoughts on that?
Well, that's a very, very important question that you've pointed in. I think the critical challenge for India, and I'm a long-term believer, that it's not possible for India to grow at high rates of 9 to 10% per annum, year after year on a consistent basis for the next 3 decades, to be able to lift a very, very young population above the poverty line without making a huge impact on education and health and nutrition. It's not possible if 1 in 2 women are anemic and 1 in 3 children are stunted, and therefore, if your learning outcomes are extremely poor, we've been able to provide access of education to all, but our learning outcomes and our grade competence per class still remain very poor. And if our infant mortality and our maternal mortality performance leave a lot more to be desired. And I think the challenge really is to make a huge, huge dent in urban areas. And one of the good things that's happened in recent times is this whole Ayushman Bharat and the process of digitization across sectors. Starting about 150,000 health and wellness centers where we are integrating allopathy, yoga, and Ayurveda together at the grassroots center, and then linking it up to health insurance, where we are the only country in the world which is providing health insurance to 500 million Indians in a digitized manner. That is, 500 million Indians means it's more than the population of USA, Europe, and Mexico put together through a cashless, paperless, portable system. And you can be living in Bihar, but you are moving to Kerala, you will carry your Ayushman Bharat insurance with you. And similarly, I think the important thing is that we are the only country in the world which has 1,200 million biometrics and 1,200 million mobile. So what India is going to throw up an enormous amount of data in the days to come, and machine learning and artificial intelligence can enable you to get the size and scale to solve your problems, tertiary care problem, because India put 66 lakhs people below the poverty line simply because it can't afford good tertiary care. But today, with this data, and India is the only country in the world which has this possibility to really make a quantum jump technologically across the world and find solutions using a health stack, much like what we've done through biometrics for the JAM Trinity. The health stack for India is really the solution to finding solutions for Indian problems. And if we, as Indians, are able to find solutions to our problems on health and education, there's a very interesting case of a young girl in Rajasthan called Aditi who runs Imbibe, a startup called Imbibe, which tracks every single student based on learning outcomes in Rajasthan. And, much like you track Uber vehicles longitudinally and latitudinally, she tracks students and provides extra dosage of education to those who lag behind in learning outcomes. So she's using technology to make a quantum jump. The Banka district of Bihar, a young collector, has used digital dashboards and mobile telephony to improve class attendance from 17% to 92%. Use of technology, 17% to 92% through geotagging and mobile telephony, and taken learning outcomes from 38% to 91%. And this is just the use of technology. So India is the only country in the world which has 1,200 million biometrics, 1,200 million mobile, 1,200 million bank accounts. No other country in the world has done it. You can use technology to make a quantum jump in health and education with the vast amount of data that you'll generate, but you need a health stack for that.
Sorry.
No, either way. You can go first.
Let me just take it back to the basics. What are we really looking at? And I'm going to unfortunately take both the education and health together because I think
Do that.
I'll take both of them
May
together.
I, for a second, and in fact, if you are addressing education, could you also address higher education? Because one of the issues that we have is that we have not enough good universities, but tons of universities proliferating with not good enough standard.
So let's start looking at numbers. There was a few years ago when I was having a conversation on the university education systems in UK, I was told that roughly the cost of imparting higher education is anywhere between 10 to 12,000 pounds. And the government subsidizes some of it and the local students pay some of it. So, but that's roughly the cost of providing the a London or Cambridge or Oxford style education. In US, it's slightly higher, $20,000, $25,000 per person per year. And we can go across the world and you will see this number. The Indian challenge is this, that if you have to provide $1,000 worth of education, so forget about the 12,000 UK style or the 25,000 US style, $1,000 education to say the 550 million Indian between 5 and 25 years of age, in that age band, 500 million, give or take a few million, you need $500 billion every year as an industry. That's the industry size. Now you can decide how much does the government subsidize from it. You can take a call. Now when the Indian finance minister walks in to deliver the Indian budget each year with great pomp and splendor, the finance minister is not carrying more than $400 to $500 billion suitcase in his hand. And from that suitcase, 85% is committed to keep the train running. And the flexibility is barely $45 to $50 billion in terms of what additional money can be diverted to additional sectors. So first of all, we have to understand that a rising India is not a rising Indian government. The Indian government is always going to be half a government. That's the tax to GDP ratio of India vis-a-vis its peers. We are half a government, and therefore government interventions cannot be the basis of response. We will have to create a marketplace where we have multiple stakeholders interested and invested in providing social infrastructure and social services. So I think the first challenge for us is, are we building the marketplace? Now, Ayushman could be a great instrument towards doing that. And it's early days and still 80% of the urban folks are uncovered. Early studies suggest that 80% are not covered by that. It's very early days, but the fact that it has moved to 20% already shows that it could have legs if we create partnerships with the private sector, partnerships with philanthropic organizations, and we create a marketplace. The second, the same number, let's start doing on health. My wife pays 300 euros in Germany as her insurance every month, which is like roughly 4,000 euros a year as insurance costs. My brother pays, I think, $700-800 in the US. And again, if you take a fraction of it and multiply it by the number of Indians, you will realize that we have very little room to maneuver through traditional public finance routes. So public finance and public institutions can only go so far and no further. Our urban future, our national future will be determined by resolving two battles that need to be resolved now. The government and private sector cannot be fighting. The citizens and communities and private sector cannot distrust each other. I think a social arrangement where the three are at peace with each other will result in a future that works. Otherwise, these contested relationships will always prevent or always lead to suboptimal outcomes.
So, I think great interventions from my colleagues. I think it's interesting. Amitabh highlighted sort of a technological intervention. Samir started with sort of talking about the finance side of it and ended, which is where I want to pick up, talking about governance. And in a sense, it's a little bit old-fashioned and passé, but I think it's kind of the bedrock on which a lot of these things depend. Social service delivery around education and health depends on getting your governance structure substantially right. And there's sort of, in the academic literature, there's a lot of these debates about the long route versus the short route of accountability. And I think this metaphor of a short route of accountability is really important. That if you're going to deliver services to people, there needs to be a way in which people can hold those who are meant to deliver those services accountable to them in the shortest possible way. So moving to, and this is a larger theme, I think, for the urbanization conversation, how do we move to a situation where you decentralize power and allow local authorities to be creative using technology, subject to finance, but allowing local authorities to be creative about solving their problems in a way that is suitable to their context? That builds the kind of trust Samir was talking about between public sector, government, and private sector. I don't know, and this is, I think, something we can come to. I don't know how successfully we are moving down that path of decentralization. I just had a chat with my colleagues at CPR. There's an urban team there. I'm actually not part of it, so I'm a bit of a dilettante in this conversation, but nonetheless, they gave me an incredible number. It said that in China, for example, half of total government expenditure is spent by cities. Mm-hmm. In India, 3% is spent by cities. And if you don't have control over the finances, you're not properly decentralized. Correct. And so the governance challenge, the base construct of building a short route of accountability, including having financial authority, I think is key to this question of education and health, and probably to a lot else that we'll talk about.
Let me problematize this a bit further. It's not only about the traditional governance questions that clearly require response in India. I think there are new governance questions on the horizon that we are ignoring. The most important social and physical services today are delivered by the private sector. How do you hold the private sector accountable? Now, I have said this in other public fora, that is it time to elect the boardroom? You know, if the boardroom is going to provide if private boardrooms are going to deliver utilities, internet, is there a accountability? And I mean, election is my way of just trying to suggest a way, that is there some way to have the boardrooms more accountable to the communities they serve? Now, you know, big tech companies, big utilities which are now privatized are providing much of our daily support, much of and sustain much of our daily existence. How do we make them and include them in this process of accountability, or trust, of a circular conversation that informs each other? And I think that still takes place through the intermediary, which is government, which is already understaffed and overworked in trying to you know, manage their own part of the bargain. And therefore, you see a distance increasing between the provider and the consumer, and therefore you see grievances, pent-up anger, frustration, political mobilizations, people on the street. When they were in a village, they had a Panchayati Raj, they had no resources, but they had someone to talk to. They said, go under that tree, I can talk to the person, and they would end up with nothing. But at least they had that relationship with the person who was in charge. In a big city, these same people are lost, their grievances are growing, and they have no way even to have a conversation. So I think this is also the changing nature of city governance that needs to be.
Amitabh, just a second. I just want to put a question here. And this is picking up from what all of you have actually said. I want to address the question of, digital governance that we were talking about, and link it to something that Navroz was saying, and in fact, Samir was saying, that, you know, when you go on the ground, and that's a lot, a lot of what my work has been as well, that when you go on the ground and you look at how policy is being delivered, services are being delivered in the last mile, you find that the links are, for all the big and great and promising ideas, the links often break at a very local level. And the way in which these links break differs from district to district, from village to village, from town to town, right? So, of course, big data and tech and all of that raises other massive, biometrics particularly raise other massive issues of privacy, of capital, of surveillance capitalism, and so on and so forth. But this is not the forum to get into that, so I'm going to leave that be. But what I will ask is, a two-part question, is that are we relying too much on tech and too little on governance, and particularly in how we formulate policy, how we assess the effectiveness of policy at the most basic level, and maybe decentralization is a very key point there. And the second is, even if we are talking about a digital future in a country where, despite being a robust democracy, at least to my mind, we've led the world in terms of internet shutdowns in 2018 and 2019, and I'm scared to see what the figures for 2020 will look like. Can we really plan for a digital future in such a scenario?
So first of all, Pragya, I'm a great believer in the fundamentals of governance at the grassroots level. And, it's not possible for us to do good municipal governance if you're not able to get your primary schools right. You can't privatize primary school, and you should not. And you should not privatize primary health center, and you should not. And unless and until we don't get those fundamentals right in primary schools, get your learning outcomes right, get your primary health centers right, and ensure that your health outcomes on a number of indices are right. And unless you don't, a vast amount of delegation of authority needs to be done at municipal governance level. India has been a very, very reluctant urbanizer, and that's happened largely because, pre-independence, we had, Rajendra Prasad was a mayor of Patna city. Rajgopalachari was a mayor of Chennai, and Motilal Nehru was the mayor of Allahabad. Post-independent, for 70 years, actually, for close to 60 years, we had no scheme for urban development. All our attention was focused on rural schemes, but the people from rural areas kept moving from urban to urban areas. And Jawaharlal Nehru Urban Renewable Mission was the first scheme which came in for urban areas. And now the Smart City Mission and Amrut have come in. Important thing is that Firstly, we've put too little resources, as rightly Navroz said, that we put too little resources into urban areas and census towns. But more important than that is that urban areas and urban cities, and you go to Allahabad, you go to Varanasi, you go to Bodh Gaya, you'll realize this, that urban cities have not shown the political will and the determination to raise their own resources. So Allahabad city, I was surprised that the water and electricity charges have not been raised for the last 3.5 decades. Now, if you're not able to raise resources, and as the district collector of Calicut in Kerala, I've also been the mayor of Calicut, where charges had not been raised for about 15 to 18 years in a very highly enlightened state like Kerala. So if you're not able to raise resources with the political will domestically within the city, you will not put resources, and therefore you'll make yourself very dependent on the state government, one. And number two, state governments, by and large, across India have been very reluctant to empower municipalities because we've had no political power coming from municipal cities. Devendra Fadnavis was the first mayor of an Indian city to become a chief minister of a state, and he himself did not empower the municipalities of Bombay and other cities. So you need to, one, empower. Secondly, you need mayors to raise resources domestically to be able to do good. I mean, and thirdly, I'm a strong believer that you need to improve functioning of schools and primary health centers, and I run this program called the Aspirational District Program across 115 of the most backward districts of India, some of the most difficult, challenging districts, and we do governance on a real-time basis. We collect data, put it out in public domain, and we challenge these districts to perform well, and every collector is competing with the others. We need to do a similar kind of exercise for municipalities, not merely on cleanliness, but on performance of education, on performance of health, on performance of nutrition, so that urban areas radically improve.
You asked a question on the kind of education being delivered. Yeah. And I'm going to give you a report by Pratham on the rural. And these are numbers that I just want to read out. A report released last week based on a survey conducted in 26 districts across 24 states by education. 37.4% of children below 6 are able to recognize at least letters, and only 25.6% can do addition. Similarly, only 34.8% of children in class 2 can read a text meant for the level below. And at class 3, only 50% can read text meant for 2 levels below. Now, this is a rural survey. Why am I giving you a rural survey for an urban conversation? Because these kids are going to be your future urban citizens. They are going to be moving to the cities, and when they reach the city and they realize that their labor is not going to give them a job, and in the service sector and in other digital economy sectors, they will require certain learning capabilities and knowledge, they will be lost. And what will they do? They will join the closest political protest that is happening at that time. That is what they're going to do.
Sorry, Navroz.
Just very briefly to come in, because you sort of raised this question in the context of digital governance. Yeah. And I think we have to be careful here to make sure that technology is an instrument, is our servant and not our master in these things, right? It's a means to an end, and we have to be cautious. So if there's some information we want to have, if it is embedded in structures of accountability that make sense, well and good. But there are lots of things that we can do that are quite simple. I think we're having a fascinating experiment going on right now with AAP in Delhi. We'll find out on the 8th just how politically popular their experiment with school governance has been. And that hasn't been a technology-based thing, right? Yeah. What did they do? They said, we're going to empower the people who care most about the fact that the kids can't do multiplication. Correct. That is the parents. Correct. We're going to have structured and proper and serious parent-teacher meetings. As simple as that, right? It's kind of a bedrock foundation story. Now you can add on all kinds of things to that in terms of data analysis technology and so on. But I think we haven't explored and plumbed the limits of the simple solutions.
No, absolutely, I couldn't agree more. So most often than not, where the link is broken, the solutions are really, really practical and simple and common sense solutions. But I do, before moving on, I want to come to what you were talking about, but I do want to talk about internet shutdowns, only because when we're talking about Ayushman Bharat and we're talking about every single person being able to access healthcare through their biometrics, then, I
So
mean,
before
what
we move
happens when cities are shut down?
Before we move to the shutdown, I just want to add another number that we should know about. You know, I was reading that we have 1 million students pursuing higher studies overseas today. Over 1 million students in various parts of the world. Now just multiply that again by a number. Just pick a number, $20,000 per student every year. And suddenly you realize that you have this huge chunk of money that is being deployed by Indians to subsidize international education systems. Now, if we can create international institutions, because see, the Indian upper middle class and elites have voted with their feet to actually send all their kids to international institutions. Why are we missing out again on an opportunity where their money and their ability to pay can be used to subsidize many of our own education programs? I think we are subsidizing American education, they don't need it. We are subsidizing UK education, they don't need it. We need to make sure we build world-class institutions that allow us to subsidize our own grassroots infrastructure.
I'm going to do something. Sorry, do you want to quickly take the question? I mean, how do we walk this line between sort of security and availability of internet across the? Is that a concern?
I can
or
give you a quick answer on that. I think when you the only instrument you have is a hammer, everything is a nail. Now, I think what internet shutdown, and I'll give you an anecdotal conversation which happened recently at the Raisina Dialogue. One of the top security folks from one of the Five Eyes came to the dialogue and he was telling us, are you kidding me? Why do you shut down the internet? We take down the website. They don't even know. They have the technical capabilities to interdict at levels without using brute force. So they take down 60,000 websites on a weekly basis. They don't shut down the net. They just take down any content. They just hack it. They just make it inaccessible. They just DDoS it so powerfully that they don't need to disturb anyone else. Now, I think when you don't have the you've built such a big ecosystem. I think and this is always going to be India's story. Our economic and social growth is going to always outpace our governance growth for the next decade or two. So you will see sometimes blunt instruments being used for where precise and directed means would perhaps have been more. And of course, we use the nice colonial laws that allow us to be empowered to do that.
I really hope we don't shift to a conversation from smart cities to smart repression, because that doesn't sound very appealing to me.
Sadly, they seem to be shadowing one another right now. But I want to move on.
But Pragya, I think on that, the Supreme Court has given a very clear verdict in saying that it's a fundamental right. And I think we should go by what the Supreme Court has said.
Absolutely. I want to move on now, and I'm going to do something highly irregular, which is quote Ghalib in a conversation about the economy and urban India. But you'll see in a minute that it's contextual, which is "Mana ke Dilli rahe, khayenge kya." I want to talk a little bit about people moving to urban areas or urban areas and the situation with jobs. And there are two parts to this question. I'd like to start with you, Amitabh. One is that even if the economy was doing really just fine, I mean, and when I say by just fine, it was meeting targets where the GDP is concerned, inflation is concerned, etc. Even in that scenario, are we capable of producing 1 million jobs a month? And of course, in this scenario, the economy is not performing by all parameters as it should be performing. We're down to 5%. Inflation, particularly because of food, particularly vegetables, is high. There is, according to Manmohan Singh, a real risk of stagflation coming up. IMF has said what it has said. One could go on and on. But where does that leave us in terms of creating jobs, in terms of creating payroll?
So one is that jobs are a challenge. And secondly, the kind of jobs people get is a challenge because their aspiration is at one level and the kind of jobs they are getting is at another level. But to expect government to create all jobs in today's world is not feasible. And I think we must also understand we are in the midst of a gig economy, and we are in the midst of a world of a lot of disruption. We are in the midst of a lot of changes that will take place because of technology, and therefore we need to also restructure our education system. And this Anglo-Saxon system of education that we have inherited of studying books and moving to the next class needs to be altered. And especially, I mean, our experience with starting about 4,500 tinkering labs with, robots, 3D printers, and Internet of Things that from class 6 onward is that, students become very, very innovative at a very young age. And secondly, the future of work really lies in being multidisciplinary and being multi-skilled. And that has to change because I don't see in India government being able to create jobs at that scale and size at all. And large companies will also find it very difficult to create jobs. There are several studies by Kaufman and others with reference to many countries which have shown that actually new jobs and new kind of jobs will have to be created by young enterprises and by young startups. But I think what is incumbent on the government is to create the right ecosystem, which is vibrant, which is dynamic, and which enables many enterprises to grow and flourish.
Yeah, sure. And I would like all of you to talk about whether the issues that we're facing, do you really believe that they're all cyclical? Because without the economy picking up, I don't see how anybody, whether the government or the private sector, will be able to create the kind of jobs we need.
No, so I want to very clearly say that the issues are not merely cyclical, they are also structural. So we need all kinds of reforms. We need to provide adequate amount of credit. We need a lot of banking sector reforms. We need also structural reforms across agriculture, across labor, across manufacturing. So the government itself says that you need both the challenges of today's world and today's economy requires both cyclical and structural reforms.
I'm sorry, very quickly, I want to ask you a slightly political question. You know, we had this Amazon, Bezos was here and he announced a huge investment into India, and the very next day you were attacked on Twitter by RSS ideologues saying that you are rather too fond of Amazon. I just wonder if on top of all the troubles that India is facing, ideology can also get in the way of reform.
Yeah, so, I'm a long-term believer and I'm an optimist about India's growth. I think we've carried out a lot of structural reforms in India's economy. All these structural reforms of GST, IBC, RERA, DBT will pay us a lot of dividend in the coming years. We should also realize that our e-commerce is just 1% of the total retail market. We have to make it grow. We need jobs. And actually, in the years to come, retail and e-commerce will create a lot of jobs. I mean, many of our new startups, like delivery, for instance, they create a vast amount of jobs. You look at Swiggy, you look at Waycool, all of them have created vast amount of jobs, and therefore allow everyone to grow and flourish. I mean, we must be very confident about ourselves. I mean, you are in a globalized world. You have to be an integral part of the global supply chain. Without that, India can't grow at rapid rates, and we need to be very, very confident about ourselves.
So I just want to jump in here to sort of link this discussion on jobs and growth and the nature of global supply chains to a conversation we started at the beginning, which is both Sameer's reference to the fourth industrial revolution and the fact that globally we have to decarbonize at a pace of change that is probably 10 times faster than the kind of labor productivity we saw through the Industrial Revolution. We have to build fundamentally different kind of economies. And for that, we need a workforce. So we need to be strategic to the extent we can about anticipating what that looks like. And then we need a workforce that's capable of the skill set to take advantage of these new directions, as well as take advantage of the technological shifts that are occurring. It's a very, very big ask. And part of the challenge in doing that, again, comes back to some of the capacity issues within our strategic structures, thinking within government, within research institutions, ability to actually talk across all of these. So the framing of the jobs question, obviously there's a short-term, immediate 2 to 5 year cycle jobs question, but then there's a 30 to 50 year jobs question, which I think is an even larger and harder question. And there we have to anticipate things like a transition to a dominantly electric economy. We have to transition to, for example, thinking in terms of public transport systems. We cannot build cities around the private car anymore. It's simply not going to be feasible. So what are the patterns of urbanization that both allow job creation, that allow less congestion, that allow better air pollution, that allow low carbon. So it's a complex kind of multiple objective framing of this.
You know, curiously, and I'm going to actually take a note from what Navroz said, and before that what Mr. Khan said. And I'm just going to make 2 points here on jobs. The first, as I have and Shashi have argued in this book, and we're going to discuss this at 1:40, India is probably going to be the first, depending on how many times we demonetize, the first $10 trillion economy in the next 15 years. So depending, I mean, and there are some extraneous factors which we can't account for. But in the next 15 to 20 years, a $10 trillion economy is a safe bet. And we're going to be the first $10 trillion economy and a $10 trillion global big power that is going to have a very different characteristic than either Pax Americana, which was geopolitical and muscular capitalism, or the geoeconomic superpower, which is China, you know, exported your way into dominance. India is going to be the first world's development superpower. I think our SDG experiences are all exportable. And I think while Mr. Kant is talking about an AI garage and sending AI solutions around the world, I think every SDG experience that India is undergoing at this particular point of time is a service for the world. And it can be commoditized and can create workforces that can transplant and build these capacities in a billion people strong African continent and in our own neighborhood in Southeast Asia. So I think the development sector in the fourth IR is a never, it has no prior template, and everything that India does is a commoditized offering for the world, and can we build a workforce around that? So I think that's the first opportunity. Second, the decarbonized $10 trillion economy is a huge new template. And the green jobs, you know, be it the LEDs, be it the fact that, you know, the Chinese produce the raw material, the intellectual property is European, but somehow the aggregated solar power plant in India is cheaper than anywhere else. Now, this is some Indian jadoo. Magic that we can take the IPR and products from 2 different locations and yet produce an aggregate complex which is cheaper than either of the 2, right? So this is again something, a decarbonized model of growth also offers a huge potential to create workforces. But is our education and curriculum designed to produce the workforce for this? Are we investing in the only thing we have to export to the world, which is human capital? And as the Foreign Secretary said last week, that if the human mind or human activity or data is gold, then India has 1/7 of proven reserves. Now, I think in that sense, how do we capitalize that proven reserve? How do we nourish it? And the question comes back to health, education, skilling, and governance. And of course, no internet shutdowns.
Sorry, very quickly, I just realized that we just have 2 minutes before I have to open this up, and I really want to address climate change. I want to address air, but I want to start with something more fundamental, more immediate, which is air pollution and river pollution. I mean, at least in some of our cities, it's a real health emergency. And Navroz, maybe starting with you, what are the real solutions that we need to be looking at immediately?
Well, the bad news first is that whatever we might be reading here and there in bits of the media, we're actually not on track to solve this problem. And I really don't think, to be very blunt about it, that the structure and process we put in place, which is the National Clean Air Plan, is going to help us solve this. This is one area where there's a misplaced emphasis on the urban. So everything else we've talked about this panel, I completely concur. The urban is the starting point. On air pollution, it's a regional problem, but we're treating it like a city problem. And that's really an issue. It's going to set us down the wrong path. So I'm sorry you asked me for things that we should do. I'm starting with things that we shouldn't do. The reason air pollution, let me just sort of also pause by underscoring how much of a crisis it is. We are basically in the National Capital Territory of Delhi, we're basically at 3 times our national standards. We're closer to 6 times WHO safe standards. So we have about 140 parts per million average annual exposure to PM 2.5. We should be no more than 40 according to Indian standards, less than that according to WHO standards. We don't really know what this looks like in terms of health impacts. Our current pollution is worse than China's. In 2016, it was almost double Beijing's, even though our GDP is half that. GDP per capita is half that. So we cannot follow a model anywhere near China's. on this. So what do we do about this? One reason it's complicated is that there are 3 or 4 different sources that are almost equal in India. So it's not a single thing. Air pollution looks like a single thing, but it's actually a sum of transport, industry, dust, biomass burning within the city, and biomass burning, that is crop burning, outside the city. So these are actually 4 or 5 20% problems. And politically, the reason that's so hard is you cut one of them in half. So you cut transport in half. Heroic effort. It almost won't make a difference. But you have to do it because it's one of your 5 big problems. So to make heroic efforts and for the public not to see the fruit is what makes this so hard politically. So we actually now to start thinking about this in terms of a 4 or 5 part problem and set benchmarks for each of them separately. And build our institutional machinery in that way. At the moment, we're not doing that. We're thinking about it as a single problem, and we're putting the emphasis on city plans. And that's really not going to take us as far and as fast as we need to go.
You know, and I think this offers an opportunity for India at a time when our economy is pretty much bottomed or flatlined at this time. If you look at the inflation, we are not growing. We are a standstill economy. If you look at that, I think if we can come up with a bold, ambitious plan to combat air pollution, because this is something which will get you political buy-in across at least your communities, you can attract huge investments for green cities, green infrastructure, green agriculture, green supply chains, green transportation. You can, attract huge financial flows, which will not only help you in 10 years to reach a place where you will be able to see remarkable difference, but also stimulate your economy. I think going green or fighting air pollution helps you combat climate change. Of course, gives you cleaner air, but also stimulates your economy. I think this is the time when we can look at the trifecta of opportunity that bad air presents us. And I think the biggest challenge to responding to this is bad politics. I think the distrust between state, center, and the regions that you're talking about is something that is going to impair our ability to work as a collective to respond to this regional wicked problem.
So, I quite agree with Navroz on many of the things he said. But fundamentally we must understand that there has been a failure of municipal governance in India. I mean, Delhi, if you look at it, you go to the eastern part of Delhi and the western part of Delhi, and you'll find it's full of dirt and filth, just full of dirt and filth. And some of our cities like Indore and Bhopal have demonstrated, and 5 years back I was in Indore, one of the filthiest cities, and today it's the cleanest city in India. If Indore and Bhopal can do it, so can Delhi do it. And you can't have smart cities without ownership of smart people. The people have to take responsibility. So I think we need to do the fundamentals right, and that is get municipal governance back. If people don't segregate household waste at the household level, it'll be very difficult to clean up Delhi. I mean, Indore succeeded because the people took ownership and segregated waste. That's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is that the urban form is very important. It's not about urbanization. It's the urban form. Indian urban planners are still planning for sprawling cities, and therefore the mindset of urban planners need to change, that we have to move away from sprawling cities to compact dense cities. We have to move towards vertical development of India, and that you have to embed your cities with transportation, public transportation first. Your cities have to be driven by public transportation and not by cars anymore. And thirdly, that we are in the midst of the biggest revolution and disruption that is going to take place, and that is the cost of battery is falling from $1,100 per kilowatt hour and has come down to $175 dollars per hour, and that in 2.5 years' time it will be $75 per kilowatt hour, and that is the point at which the world would have moved from 2,000 parts to 20 parts, and EV revolution is on our door. And therefore, we need to really prepare ourselves for two-wheelers and three-wheelers and vehicles and public transportation, which will all be electrically driven. And that is why we said that by 2026 in Delhi, every two-wheeler must be an electric vehicle, and the whole of industry fell upon us. You know, the whole industry rose in revolt. But today, when we said this, today Bajaj, TVS, all have come out. Yesterday, TVS launched an electric scooter model, Bajaj launched it. And therefore, this revolution is upon us, and we must prepare ourselves for this. And therefore, my view is we must do the fundamentals right. That is, clean up municipalities, clean up basic governance at ward level, and allow people to take ownership.
Sorry, Mr. I just want to ask, if I might, surely, though, you cannot think that municipal governance is the solution to the air quality problem, because it's really only a small piece of it. I think it would be misleading
that's why,
to equate those two.
No, I said that, you see, air pollution is a problem of 5 things which you said. I entirely agree with you. But
Many of which are outside the
yeah, you're absolutely right. I'm not disputing that. Mobility is one part of it. Burning of stubble is another part of it. All that is right. But, you know, I'm not being Delhi-centric. I'm looking at municipal governance across India. Municipal governance has collapsed in India. Would you agree with that or not?
certainly
Across. And therefore, we need to get that municipal governance, the fundamentals of that right. Once you get that right, you would have cracked education, you would have cracked health, right?
I have a million more questions, but we are out of time. We have about 8 minutes to spare, and I'd like to take some questions from the audience. The lady over there, please. But may I please request you, if you have any comments, you have to save them for later. Questions only, and as crisply and precisely as you can. Thank you.
Okay, I'm Sangeeta, and I'm a lay person. And whereas I appreciated all of the lofty ideas and the statistics and everything, sir, I'm also have been a long-term optimist. In 40 plus years ago, when I was 21, I was, today is Republic Day, and I used to believe in hum honge kamyab, ek din, all of that.
Ma'am, could you just keep it to a question?
So, So there are 2 issues. One is, we were talking about skyline of the urban future. And I've been seeing that in 2000, as recent as 2000, I'm from Delhi, and there was, plan of 2021. Now 2020 is there, and so they've forgotten about that. Now next plan has come up, 2041. So I would like to know, our leaders across political spectrum have failed us miserably, and so how can they be made to be responsible and accountable to us?
Okay, got that
we have
question.
believed in them. And one more thing is about the education.
Ma'am, I'm sorry. We'll just be able to take one question. It's not fair on the other audience members. Would you want to just answer that before we take on other questions, or do you want to just... Okay. The lady in front here.
You gave a very right solution that electric cars and vehicles should be introduced to reduce pollution, etc. But I sometimes feel we have the habit of putting the cart before the horse. Don't you think first we should devise ways of producing more electricity to be able to introduce this? And we have so much solar energy available which we are not exploiting. What other plans do you think we should do before we put this policy into practice?
The lady at the back over here.
Hello. Hi, my name is Vidushi, and I'll keep it very short. So I've worked at the local municipal level of governance a lot, and my question, and you've mentioned municipal governance, structural reforms, all of these things. My question is that even though we're decentralizing the systems at the local level, the people working at the municipalities, say the officers, are still very, very centralized in practice. So what are your ideas or thoughts on that? Like, still a lot of power rests with the municipal commissioners, even if we decentralize the systems. So how do we think about changing those structures? Thank you.
Just one more question up here in front, and then we'll see if we can take another lot. Sorry, sir, this gentleman over here. Sorry, we'll come to you.
My question is, in our imagination, do we have any role for a municipal corporation beyond service delivery institutions? So they are basically functioning just as service delivery institutions. Do they have any role like making rules or something in our in the mind of our policymakers? Thank you.
Okay, so starting from there, maybe.
I think all questions are
Failure of, yes, they're all questions. Sir.
all questions are to you.
Failure of political leadership, and then on.
I'll come on one thing. I'll come on the municipal.
Well, I think most of them are for you, in fact. But I'll just maybe make one quick comment on the.
I want to respond to the question about solar power charging our electric vehicles. It's a chicken and egg story. Actually, India has now started generating a lot of electric EV solar power. But you know, one area where we need a lot of more push is the solar rooftop. That's the one sector where we've not tapped fully. And that's because solar power then has to be sold to the utility, and the utility is not inclined to buy it because they buy it at a particular rate. No, where we have to really push for, and where the biggest disruption will come, will be in battery storage. And battery storage really holds the key to India's future. And to my mind, if we are able to crack that, you will see solar rooftop taking place in every single household, and two-wheelers, three-wheelers will all get charged with clean power. And EVs need to be charged with clean power. And that is a very right question that you asked. And to my mind, this breakthrough should happen in the next year or so in India in terms of large-scale solar storage in a year and a half or two, and solar storage will really lead the revolution for rooftop charging.
Can I just jump in on this? I think there's a certainly the future is renewable energy, storage is going to be key, but when we bring it back to urban areas, and I keep talking and I keep hearing about electric two-wheelers, three-wheelers, electric two-wheelers, three-wheelers, and so on, you know, we're forgetting that we might be moving from congestion to clean congestion, even if this is in fact renewable energy. I'm just not sure that the private vehicle is possible in India over the next couple of decades. It's just not an option. I mean, right now we're talking about 1.8 million commuters a day in Delhi. In London, it's under a million. It's 700,000 commuters a day, and we are much more dense. We currently have the car ownership in India of about 22 odd people per thousand, which is the car ownership in the US of about 1920, right? And think about if we're going to go down that curve, it's simply not feasible. So just to say,
I don't agree with Navroj.
Has to be public transport and shared mobility.
See, let's not talk about four-wheeler. India's strategy, in India, 82% of the vehicles are two-wheelers and three-wheelers. The cost of a three-wheeler EV today is actually just become cheaper than a combustion three-wheeler. India's strategy has to ensure that two-wheelers become EV, and in the next 1.5 years' time, two-wheelers will become cheaper than three-wheelers. And don't go for four-wheelers, don't bother about four-wheelers. Public transportation has to be the key. I'm a great believer in public transportation. Ensure long-run, long-range, intra-city movements must be driven by CNG. Long-term city-to-city movements must be driven by LNG, and that's doable in India. Public transportation holds the key. All cities must embed themselves with public transportation. That's the future.
Okay, can I quickly come in on the municipal question? I think that's a very interesting question for someone who's been watching this space across the world, by the way. And certainly even in India, and I think Mr. Kant mentioned one of the cities, Indore, the municipal corporation has now become a raiser of funds. They have raised a municipal bond. They're talking about raising a green bond, which they're going to deploy for creating green services and infrastructure. The Mumbai Municipal Corporation is the richest municipal corporation in the world, and they should be, in a sense, underwriting and crowding in huge investments to change the Mumbai landscape. So I think the municipalities are going to move beyond just the delivery of services to actually creation of solutions, creation of finance, and thereby creation of new frameworks for policy and politics. On the question of master plan, I think it follows from Mr. Khan's earlier intervention that the Indian political system was designed in a way that political power resided in villages and economic wealth resided in cities. That was the distribution of peacekeeping. How to maintain peace in the world, give political power to villages, give no political power to cities. I think once the 60% of Indian population starts living in cities in the next 20 years, or maybe even now in the next 10 years, you will see the political clout of cities becoming far more significant. I think thereafter you will see the city politics becoming far more influential. And I'll leave it at that, but let's see how that plays out.
I had a lot more questions, and I'm sorry I couldn't take your questions either. We're entirely out of time, but I have one good suggestion, which is all three of them have written books. Please buy them, and you are likely to find a lot more answers there. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for talking to me.